Michael hated the sharp hum of the hovercars outside his loft window almost as much as he hated the blinking reminder on his wristband calendar. Family dinner, December 24th, 1830. Location, Lorraine's estate. He had tried every excuse the past 3 years: work deadlines, impossible traffic, last-minute emergencies. But this year, Grandmother Ruth had called him personally, her frail voice threading through the line like a plea wrapped in iron. "Don't let them chase you out of your own blood, Michael. Hold your ground. That's what your grandfather would have wanted." And so, against his better instincts, he found himself smoothing the sleeves of his one decent jacket, black wool a little frayed at the cuffs, and climbing onto his battered smart bike, the pedals creaking but still loyal. He had coded the bike's navigation software himself, a quiet project no one in his family had ever asked about. They didn't ask about much unless it involved salary figures or square footage. The city shimmered around him in chrome and glass as he rode through neon canyons, his tires humming against the energy lanes. Giant billboards pulsed with curated personal brands, perfect smiles, perfect homes, perfect families. Derek's face had appeared once on a financial district screen, announcing some merger or another. His cousin's jawline chiseled under the caption, "Visionary Banker of the Year." Michael remembered standing in the crowd below, clutching his grocery bag, wondering if Derek had ever carried one in his life. By the time he reached Lorraine's estate, his calves burned and his collar was damp. The gate recognized his ID reluctantly, pausing a half-second longer than usual, as if even the algorithms doubted he belonged. He pushed through anyway, past the sculpted hedges and the glow lilies genetically programmed to bloom in synchronized waves of red and green for the holiday season. The house itself rose like a cathedral of glass and steel, angular, cold, expensive. Michael parked his bike discreetly behind a decorative pillar where it wouldn't offend anyone's eyes, tugged his jacket straight again, and braced himself. Inside, the air smelled of roasted protein slabs and synthetic pine. Lorraine's voice carried before he even saw her. "Michael, darling, you made it. We were just betting whether your little bicycle could survive the hills." She stood at the center of the foyer, champagne in hand, diamonds glittering at her ears, her smile carved sharp enough to wound. Around her clustered the family, dressed in shades of platinum and midnight, fabrics that whispered their cost with every shift. Derek lounged near the fire projection, already holding court, his arm draped casually around the waist of a woman Michael didn't recognize. He saw her then, Clara, tall, effortlessly poised, hair falling in sleek waves that caught the light, a dress that was elegant without being loud. But it wasn't her beauty that held him, it was the glint in her eyes, a spark of amusement that seemed to slice through the heavy air. Derek's voice boomed as he introduced her. "Clara, meet my cousin Michael. What is it again? Still coding apps in that shoebox loft?" Michael extended his hand, steady. Clara took it, her grip warm, her gaze direct. "A developer? That sounds refreshingly real." The corner of her mouth quirked, a smile half hidden but dangerous enough to draw Derek's arm tighter around her waist. Dinner was announced soon after, a long table groaning under the weight of genetically perfected dishes, each tagged with glowing nutritional stats that hovered just above the plates. Michael slid into his usual spot halfway down, across from Ruth, who reached for his hand with fingers cool and trembling. "You came," she whispered. Her cloudy eyes glistened. He squeezed back gently, the only anchor in this sea of polished derision. Lorraine began the show almost immediately. "So, Michael," she purred, tapping her fork against her glass for attention, "still riding that little bike around town? Such dedication to exercise, I suppose." Laughter rippled down the table. Derek leaned forward, smirking. "You know, I passed by his building once. I swear the whole place could fit in my guest bathroom." More laughter. Michael let it wash over him like static. He focused on the steam rising from his plate, the smell of engineered herbs tickling his nose. Clara's eyes flicked between them, curiosity sharp. "Is it true, Michael?" she asked suddenly, voice light, almost teasing, "that you don't even own a car?" The question hit like a thrown knife, not cruel on the surface but designed to draw blood in this family where vehicles were status symbols, rolling declarations of power. The table chuckled in anticipation, heads tilting toward him to watch the squirm. Derek's grin widened. Lorraine leaned back, satisfied. He had spent years learning these subtle dynamics, reading the room not with arrogance, but with patience. He understood the rhythm, the pauses before laughter, the tiny lean of a shoulder forward when dominance was asserted, the way eyes darted for validation, and he waited, as he always did, for the right moment. It came during dessert. The chef drones had placed holographic sugar sculptures across the table, their filigree glowing faintly, almost like constellations suspended in mid-air. Derek was busy pointing out the algorithms behind the light sequencing, explaining which drone models they had used and how they interfaced with the AR layer. Lorraine, her eyes still simmering with irritation, leaned closer to Michael. "Do you ever think about upgrading, Michael? A real car, a proper apartment? Or are you content with this?" She gestured vaguely toward him, her hand slicing the air like a blade. Michael looked at her, his expression placid, and for the first time felt the full weight of control. He could respond with anger, with sarcasm, with self-defense, but none of that would matter here. This wasn't a contest of loudness, it was about subtlety, about letting their assumptions crumble quietly while he remained steady. Clara, sensing the moment, leaned slightly toward him, her elbow brushing his just enough to send a faint spark through the tension of the room. "So, Michael," she said, her tone teasing, "is it true you don't even own a car?" The words were deliberate, soft, challenging, but not cruel. Every head turned, waiting for his reaction. Derek's grin tightened, his body tense as if ready to pounce. Lorraine's eyes flickered with curiosity and impatience. Michael paused, savoring the anticipation, then let a slow smirk curve his mouth. "Depends," he said evenly, letting the word hang. Then, leaning ever so slightly toward Clara, he added, "Are you asking because you'd actually like to go for a ride with me?" The effect was instantaneous. Clara's laugh rang through the hall, genuine, musical, and warm, a sound that seemed almost alien in this sterile, status-obsessed environment. Derek's shoulders tensed, his jaw clenching as the color drained from his face. Lorraine blinked, momentarily flustered, the script of control she had memorized for decades unraveling in front of her. Even the drones flickered momentarily, struggling to recalibrate sentiment metrics. Michael leaned back, letting the moment settle. For the first time, the balance had shifted. He wasn't the outsider anymore, he was a participant on his own terms, and Clara's attention, a blend of amusement and curiosity, made the point more effectively than any argument could. Dinner resumed around him, but the energy had changed. Derek attempted to reclaim dominance, detailing a recent acquisition, his words dripping with the authority of wealth and connections. Lorraine interjected with calculated praise for Derek's achievements, attempting to overshadow Michael. But the subtle undercurrent of the table had flipped. Guests whispered quietly, scanning Michael, noting the calm control he exhibited, the confident ease in the way he engaged without needing to dominate. Michael noticed each glance, each twitch of muscles in Derek's jaw, the rigid set of Lorraine's shoulders. He felt the quiet satisfaction of having disrupted the hierarchy without a single raised voice. His secret, the acquisition of his own software company for an undisclosed but substantial sum, remained unspoken, a latent threat dangling in the unspoken space between them. Every look he shared with Clara, every slight gesture, fed the tension, building anticipation for the revelation yet to come. The conversation flowed into lighter topics, but Michael maintained focus, his body language calm, precise. He leaned in subtly to comment on the timing of the dessert drones, a small, innocuous observation, but Clara laughed again, brushing her hand lightly against his. Derek's attempts to dominate became increasingly transparent, his words sharp, almost desperate, and Lorraine's composure cracked in tiny flickers. An eyebrow raised too high, a sniff too loud, a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. Michael's attention flicked back to Clara, who met his gaze steadily, a challenge in her expression that invited play without requiring confrontation. He responded with a faint, private smile, letting her sense his composure and his confidence. He had become, in a subtle but undeniable way, the pivot of the room. People noticed, Derek noticed, Lorraine noticed, Clara noticed. Grandmother Ruth, watching quietly from her seat, allowed herself a small nod, a glimmer of pride passing through her tired eyes. She had always known the boy could endure, that beneath his modest exterior lay a mind and presence capable of commanding a room without shouting, without force. Michael caught her glance, allowed a fleeting smile to acknowledge her, and returned to the table. The chatter continued, but Michael's presence had changed the texture of the dinner. He wasn't the object of ridicule. He was the center of subtle attention, the one whose reactions, or lack thereof, dictated the rhythm of the evening. The family continued their performances, their laughter, their boasts, but now the narrative was no longer his failure. It was the contrast between their loud declarations and his quiet command. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared and the AR projections of winter constellations danced across the ceiling, Clara leaned slightly toward him, her voice low, teasing. "So, tell me about those little projects you've been tinkering with, the ones Derek calls hobbies." Michael's smirk deepened. "I'll tell you someday," he said, the weight of his words almost inaudible, yet charged, "when you're not surrounded by an audience." Clara's eyebrows lifted slightly, the spark of intrigue in her eyes mirrored by the tiniest curve of her lips. It was more than flirtation, it was recognition, an acknowledgement that he existed on a plane beyond the table's petty contests, and she was curious to see how far that plane could rise. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of mechanical clinks, polite laughter, and the subtle calculations of status shifting in real time. Michael, for the first time in years, didn't count the minutes until the dinner ended. He counted the nuances, the micro-victories, the small signals of attention that told him he was no longer the butt of the joke. By the time the family began to drift toward the sitting room, post-dinner drinks in hand, Michael felt a subtle, gratifying change in the atmosphere. He hadn't declared victory. He hadn't needed to. He had simply existed in his truth, calm, self-possessed, and quietly commanding. And Clara, who had witnessed it, had laughed in a way that promised attention, connection, and maybe, in time, complicity in whatever came next. As he followed the guests toward the lounge, Michael felt the first real trace of warmth in the evening. Not the warmth of artificial lights or designer wines, but the warmth of presence, recognition, and quiet power. Somewhere under the laughter and boasts, under the clinking of glasses and the hum of hover drones, he had shifted the axis of the room. And for the first time, he allowed himself to consider that the real game had only just begun. Michael felt the ripple of attention linger long after dessert had been cleared, the holographic sugar sculptures now reduced to faintly glowing embers of light across the table. Guests lingered over after-dinner drinks, their status scores flickering like neon pulses above their heads, while Derek continued to dominate the conversation, leaning back in his seat, his wrist tapping over his wearable feed as though to remind everyone of his importance. Clara, however, had not left Michael's side. She had drifted just enough closer that their knees brushed beneath the table once or twice, sending sparks of heat he tried not to acknowledge. The first moment had been fleeting, almost accidental, But the second, when she passed him the carafe of red wine, their hands had touched just long enough for him to feel the pressure of her fingers, soft but assertive. He had looked up, and she had met his gaze with a small, knowing smile, one that promised amusement and challenge both. "So," she murmured lightly, leaning slightly forward, her voice just above the background chatter, "this tiny loft of yours. I've been imagining it all wrong. Tell me, how does a place like that survive in this city without a billionaire's bankroll?" Michael's smile was subtle, the kind that suggested depth without revealing all its secrets. "It survives," he said, "because I've never felt the need to impress anyone who isn't impressed by reality." He let his eyes linger on her reaction, and he caught the faint spark of recognition there, as if she understood entirely, yet without a word. Lorraine, seated across the table, stiffened. Her fingers tapped her crystal glass with a sharp rhythm, a silent punctuation to the frustration building behind her composed mask. "Michael," she said, her voice a low hiss, "this family used to have standards. And now, you've become the weak link. You're the reason this family feels broken." The words cut through the hum of polite chatter, sharp enough to make the room collectively intake breath. Gasps ran along the edges of the table like a thin electric current. Michael remained composed. He didn't flinch, he didn't defend. He merely shifted his gaze to Clara, and she, in a subtle but potent gesture, placed her hand near his on the table. It was enough for everyone to notice, and the effect was immediate. Lorraine's smile faltered, Derek's posture tightened, and the table's energy hummed with tension. Michael had never intended to dominate, yet somehow he now held the room in a delicate balance of intrigue and unease. Derek, refusing to relinquish control, leaned forward with renewed energy. "Well, I suppose some of us define happiness by actual achievement," he said, voice smooth but edged with desperation. "My condo has panoramic city views. My bonus this quarter, let's just say it would cover your rent for 5 years. And my circle, influencers, CEOs, innovators, you name it. Isn't that what real success looks like?" Clara tilted her head, her dark hair cascading over one shoulder as she smiled with the faintest trace of amusement. "Funny," she said softly, cutting through Derek's self-congratulation like a scalpel. "All those things, and yet you don't seem happy." Her words carried no accusation, just observation, but the implication landed heavier than any insult Michael had ever endured. Michael, careful not to boast, stayed silent, allowing her comment to hang. He felt the subtle shift, the faint but undeniable recognition that Clara was seeing him differently now, that she was aware of his quiet successes and the truth behind the modest exterior. And then, as if to punctuate the moment without speaking, his phone vibrated against the table. He barely glanced down. The notification flashed across the screen for a moment. "Local developers app acquired in multi-million deal." Clara's lips curved into a knowing, almost playful smile. She leaned in just slightly, letting the shared secret between them thrum in the air without a single word. Derek's grin faltered. He glanced at Michael's phone, his eyes narrowing, not understanding how someone so unassuming could possess such quiet power. Lorraine's fingers twitched against her glass stem, her control slipping through the cracks, her empire of dominance threatened not by confrontation, but by simple, undeniable reality. The rest of the evening blurred in a haze of small victories and invisible skirmishes. Michael navigated the room like a conductor of subtle orchestration, letting Clara's teasing questions guide the conversation, letting Derek's attempts at dominance falter under the weight of undeniable truth. Each brush of hands, each exchanged glance, each shared laugh built tension as thick as the synthetic wine in their glasses. Later, as the final guests began to drift toward the sleek lounge area and the chatter dimmed to murmurs, Michael found himself in the kitchen, gathering plates with quiet efficiency. Clara appeared beside him, slipping past the kitchen drones that polished the counters with meticulous robotic precision. She leaned casually against the counter, her eyes catching his. "So," she murmured, voice low, teasing, "you're secretly a millionaire, and you let Derek call you a failure?" Michael paused, setting down a plate, feeling the hum of tension in the small space between them. He stepped closer, just enough that the faintest warmth of his presence brushed against hers. "I don't measure myself by his rules," he said quietly, deliberately, letting the words linger. "Besides, I liked watching you figure it out." The pause that followed was charged, electric. Neither moved, yet the air between them vibrated with the possibilities unspoken. She leaned in slightly, close enough that viewers of the scene, or anyone witnessing, could sense the energy, could feel the unspoken question lingering in the air. She didn't kiss him, not yet, but the proximity and the tension alone were enough to make the moment unforgettable. Meanwhile, in the main dining area, the residual effects of the evening's dynamics rippled outward. Lorraine and Derek, both aware now that their usual instruments of intimidation and dominance had failed, grew increasingly desperate. Lorraine's hands trembled ever so slightly when she poured the remaining wine, her smile forced and brittle. Derek's voice, usually smooth and confident, became slightly sharp, reactive, a little too loud in an effort to reclaim attention. But Michael, in the kitchen with Clara, was untouchable, anchored by his quiet knowledge, his self-possession, and the subtle, undeniable chemistry developing between him and the one person who mattered at that moment. Clara laughed softly, shaking her head, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "I have to say," she whispered, "watching you sit there while they try to tear you apart, it's fascinating. And somehow completely satisfying." Michael tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly in playful defiance. "Fascinating," he echoed. "I like that. It's better than predictable." He handed her a plate with a slice of dessert, their fingers brushing again, a fleeting but deliberate contact that left sparks lingering. "Besides," he added, leaning just a fraction closer, "it's more fun when the other person has to figure things out for themselves." The tension between them was palpable, a low, simmering current that threaded through each moment, each word, each touch. And though neither acknowledged it explicitly, it influenced everything around them: the room, the family, the hierarchy, the unspoken rules of the gathering. Lorraine, sensing the shift but unable to articulate it fully, opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, her sharp tongue dulled by the invisible barrier Michael had created. Derek tried one last desperate maneuver, leaning toward Clara with a boast about his latest acquisition. "And you see, Clara, it's all about network, influence, leverage. You can't get far without the right connections, the right status, the right—" Clara interrupted, voice soft but pointed. "Funny, all those things, yet here we are. And you don't seem fulfilled." Her words hung in the air, a mirror held to Derek's carefully curated image. He flushed faintly, the colour rising to his neck, and his composure faltered for the briefest of moments, enough for Michael to note, silently amused, that status could be challenged without force, simply by truth and perception. The rest of the evening dissolved into subdued chatter, with Michael and Clara slipping quietly into the back garden, away from the residual storm of the dining hall. The winter air was crisp, tinged with synthetic pine from the outdoor decorations, and the faint hum of drones patrolled the perimeter in programmed perfection. They walked along the illuminated pathway, their shoulders brushing occasionally, each contact sending subtle currents of tension through them. "So," Clara said finally, voice teasing but serious, "all this time, you've been letting them think you're beneath them?" Michael glanced at her, eyes twinkling with quiet amusement, and shook his head. "I've been letting them enjoy their little illusions. Reality has a funny way of catching up, though." He paused, leaning closer so the winter chill didn't reach him. And watching you figure it out, well, that's been the best part. She laughed softly, leaning in just enough that the proximity left a lingering sense of something unspoken and urgent. Their shared awareness of his secret success, of their subtle flirtation, of the fragile cracks in the family's polished hierarchy, hung in the air like an unbroken chord, vibrating with possibilities. Even as they returned to the house to see the final stragglers leaving, Michael felt the shift inside the family dynamics. Lorraine's grip on authority had loosened, Derek's attempts at dominance were faltering, and the quiet power of authenticity, subtlety, and charm had become Michael's unspoken weapon. And with Clara by his side, intrigued and complicit in the knowledge of his hidden victories, the game had only just begun. The air in Lorraine's estate had grown thick with tension as dessert was carried in, each plate glowing faintly from its internal nanolight display, designed to highlight the intricate molecular gastronomy at its center. Guests murmured politely, but the undercurrent of attention had shifted noticeably. Derek's self-satisfied posture had slackened ever so slightly, and Lorraine's sharp eyes darted between Michael and Clara as if she were watching an imperceptible duel play out beneath the surface of polite conversation. Michael, seated quietly across from Clara, felt the weight of the room's anticipation like a tangible presence. Each glance, each micro-expression a thread in a web he now understood perfectly. Lorraine lifted her crystal glass, her fingers trembling with suppressed irritation. "Here's to family members who don't waste their lives chasing silly hobbies," she declared, her voice smooth but slicing, her eyes flicking toward Michael with the precision of a trained predator. A polite ripple of laughter followed her pronouncement, but it was faint, brittle, lacking the warmth of genuine amusement. Michael's hand remained on the table, poised but still. He would have spoken, perhaps, to defend himself, but before he could, a small, almost imperceptible movement drew his attention. Grandmother Ruth, seated at the head of the table, her frail hands gripping her own glass, lifted her gaze. The years had made her body delicate, but her presence still radiated a quiet authority that the room could not ignore. Her voice, though soft, cut through the tension with crystalline clarity. "No," Ruth said, a rare firmness threading through her tone. "Tonight, we toast those who don't need to brag, the ones who carry dignity without needing to prove anything." The statement hung in the air, vibrating like a bell through the space. For a moment, even the hovering drones seemed to pause, their sensors catching the emotional spike in the room. The silence was electric, thick with anticipation and disbelief. Guests shifted in their seats, the social fabric of the dinner subtly, irrevocably fraying. Lorraine's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing into slits, while Derek's jaw tensed, a faint flush colouring his cheekbones. Clara's hand lifted gracefully, her glass angled toward Michael in a small but unmistakable gesture. The symbolism was perfect. The outsider, the one they had all tried to belittle, had become the focus, and no words of his own were required yet. He simply met her gaze, letting the quiet exchange communicate more than 1,000 declarations of status ever could. Derek, unable to contain the tension, spoke abruptly, the words tumbling out sharper than intended. "What dignity! He's broke." The sentence landed with an unintentional clumsiness, a crack in the armor he had spent years carefully constructing. Clara's eyes flicked toward him, a slow, deliberate smirk curving her lips. "Actually, Derek," she said smoothly, almost lazily, "broke men don't get million-dollar acquisition alerts over dinner." Her voice was soft, but carried enough authority to make the comment resonate across the table. Heads turned, gasps rippled through the room as the implication crystallized in the minds of all who were present. Lorraine froze, her glass halfway to her lips, disbelief etched into every line of her face. Michael remained perfectly calm, letting the words settle. He did not need to speak. Clara's revelation had dismantled the structure of superiority with surgical precision. Derek's confident facade cracked further, his fingers tightening around his glass, nails leaving faint crescents of pressure in the crystal. The moment stretched, the silence drawing attention to the subtle victory. Michael finally lifted his voice, measured, deliberate, carrying quiet power without a trace of anger. "Maybe this family's broken," he said, "because we forgot what's worth more than bonuses and cars: respect, love, self-respect. That's all I've ever wanted, and all I'll keep." Ruth's hands rose slightly, the soft applause that followed almost sacred, acknowledging not just the words but the integrity behind them. Clara's eyes locked with Michael's across the table, the flirtation now undeniable, electric, and deeply intertwined with admiration. She lifted her glass again, small and deliberate, an unspoken celebration of victory and recognition, her fingers brushing the stem just so, leaving a subtle mark of attention. The family's hierarchy crumbled in real time. Lorraine's composure faltered visibly, the veneer of control chipping under the weight of reality. Derek slouched, his arrogance drained, replaced with the thin haze of disbelief and jealousy. Guests whispered quietly, eyes darting between the outsider and the defeated scions of status, a mix of awe and discomfort rippling through the room. Michael's silence, his calm assurance, had done what no confrontation could. He had turned the tables, and the world was watching quietly, enthralled. Clara leaned forward slightly across the table, just enough that the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the crisp, synthetic air. "You know," she murmured, her voice teasing yet low enough that only he could hear. "It's fun watching someone dismantle arrogance without lifting a finger." Michael's lips curved into a subtle, private smile. "Patience," he replied, his tone soft but edged with amusement. "It's always more satisfying when the truth reveals itself." He noticed the quick intake of breath from Lorraine and the stiffening of Derek's shoulders, and a small dark part of him felt a thrill, quiet, ethical, precise. The rest of the evening settled into a strange, new rhythm. The family continued to mingle, but the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Michael, previously relegated to the margins, was now a point of focus, not because he had shouted or schemed overtly, but because authenticity, integrity, and a quiet but undeniable competence had spoken louder than any boast. Clara stayed close, her presence a soft counterpoint to the lingering tension, and with each exchanged glance, each subtle touch, brief, accidental, intentional, the undercurrent of romantic promise thickened. As the final glasses were drained, Michael rose quietly, gathering his coat. Clara followed, moving beside him seamlessly, the space between them charged but not forced. Derek watched, his expression a mix of frustration and awe, while Lorraine remained frozen, glass still in hand, her carefully constructed empire of superiority undone by nothing more than quiet competence and clever timing. Outside, the snowfall had begun, thin flakes drifting down in the faint glow of streetlights. The air was crisp, the cityscape glittering with neon reflections in the snow. Michael secured his jacket against the cold, and Clara drew slightly closer as they walked along the slick, illuminated pathway leading to the street. She leaned in, voice low, teasing, almost breathless with amusement. "That invitation to your loft, still open?" Michael's grin was slow, deliberate, and the warmth of his response seemed to radiate despite the icy air. "Always," he said, letting the unspoken tension hang between them, promising intimacy, connection, and subtle partnership. They walked on together, side by side, warmth threading through the cold night, the possibilities of both love and triumph unfolding around them. Behind them, the estate glowed softly, a monument to wealth, status, and control, now overshadowed by quiet dignity and clever reversal, and the knowledge that sometimes true value doesn't need to announce itself with flash or sound. It simply exists, quietly powerful, waiting for the right moment to reveal its weight. Michael inhaled the sharp winter air, feeling the snowflakes melt against his cheeks, and realized he had won something far greater than approval. The quiet recognition of his worth, the dismantling of empty authority, and the first spark of connection with someone who had seen him for who he truly was. Clara's hand brushed his as they paused at a street corner, the world around them soft with falling snow. "Your loft," she repeated, her voice lighter now, eyes teasing. "I'm expecting to see more than code and plants. Show me what else a modest man can do." Michael's laughter was low, warm, resonant, blending with the soft hiss of snow beneath their feet. "You'll see," he said, "but only if you're ready for it." As they stepped into the glow of the street, leaving the estate and its fractured hierarchy behind, the promise of quiet power, self-respect, and the thrill of authentic connection carried them forward. Michael, once the overlooked underdog, now moved through the night with Clara at his side, victorious without confrontation, his dignity intact, and a flirtation simmering just beneath the surface, hinting at warmth and potential beyond the cold streets of status and wealth. The city pulsed around them, neon and snow blending, a canvas for what had been won silently: respect, love, and the undeniable fact that true value never needs to shout. It simply is.